Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about negligence. Well, we're going to talk about torts and crimes and the liability of principals and agents for those. So, quick review: we've all had 2080, but torts include intentional torts and also negligent acts. Um, and of course, crimes are violations of the civil code. So let's talk about the general rule related to both, right? And this is a quick review of legal environment. Um, Generally, individuals are liable for their own torts, right? And that's generally, you can take that to the bank, right? And their own crimes, all right? So that's just a rule. So what we're talking about here is the circumstances when someone else might also be liable for negligence and our negligence, torts, or other criminal liability. All right. To be sure, to be clear, that does not absolve someone else being liable for a negligent act, for example, um, does not absolve the would-be wrongdoer of their own liability. All right. Okay. So let's start in with the general rule. Principals are liable for their own negligence or reckless acts, even when they use an agent. All right. Simple enough. Let's look at the example. Fred is a plumber but has a history of violent crime. All right. Pipe Fixer is a company that employs Fred and sends him to a residence. While in the residence, Fred assaults a member of the household. All right. So that is that would obviously be a crime, but it's also a tort as well. Um, from the pipe fixer point of view, pipe fixer could be held liable in tort for this assault. All right, that is true. Who's in the best position to screen individuals? Well, pipe fixer. They hired Fred. All right. Um, Pipe fixer's liability does not absolve Fred for his own civil and or in this case criminal liability. All right. Okay. So the theory here would be that pipe fixer, it would be called negligent hire, which is a tort. Um, and so pipe fixer most definitely could be liable here. Okay. Continuing on. When the principal directs their agent to commit a tort or crime, both the agent and the principal can be held liable. All right. Young owns a used car dealership. Young directs his mechanic to roll back 20,000 miles of one of his inventory vehicles. All right. Um, well, in that case, both Young and mechanic are liable. Misrepresentations of the agent. All right. An example here. Carl works as a salesman at Moe's car dealership. Carr sells a crossover SUV fit only for paved roads to Gail. Carl tells Gail the vehicle is fit for off-roading. 2 weeks later, while off-roading, Gail's vehicle is disabled, presumably because it is not fit for off-roading. Gail is stranded for several days. All right. Mo can be held liable for um, Carl's misrepresentation. And you think about this. I mean, Carl is a salesman on Mo's car lot. Um, and so um, Mo, even though he may have not been aware of the misrepresentation, but he can be held liable for that. Now, keep in mind, there could be recourse, right? Mo can seek indemnification from Carl, right? Um, so Carl's still responsible for his own misrepresentation, but Mo could be responsible, and presumably the dealership is a deeper pocket than the individual. All right, so Gail can recover from the dealership, right? So that's the way that would work. Negligence of the agent. All right, so we've got some Latin here. You may remember from 2080, there's a good amount of Latin in law, and we'll start in with respondent superior, which translates to let the master answer. All right, respondent superior is a doctrine that allows for principals to be held liable for torts committed within the scope of their employment. All right, so we're talking specifically about the employee-employer relationship. All right, this is not applicable to independent contractors. All right, it is worth noting that negligent hire can be applicable to independent contractors, but it's a much more difficult case to prove, and it doesn't fall under respondent superior. All right. So generally, employers are responsible for torts committed within the scope of employment. All right. So we need to define what is the scope of employment. All right. So obviously, anything done at the direction of their employer is in the scope of employment. Things reasonably necessary to achieve the objectives of the employment are within the scope of employment. But let's talk about frolics and detours. When we talk about frolics and detours, what we're really talking about is how far away from the objective can the employee get before the employer is not held liable. All right. And so when we think of frolics and detours, you want to think of opposite ends of a continuum. All right. The general rule is that employers are responsible for detours. Detours are relatively minor deviations from the scope of employment. All right. So I am a dry cleaning delivery driver. So I work for the dry cleaners. All right. On a particularly hot day, I go about half a mile off course to stop at a convenience store and purchase a bottle of water. All right. Well, that's a detour, right? I'm working to achieve the objectives of my employer. I just was seeking to hydrate myself. So if while at the convenience store I back the van into someone else's car, my boss is probably not going to be happy with me, but they are going to be liable for what I did, right? Because that's just a detour. I went off course to get a bottle of water. All right, that's a detour. A frolic, on the other, is at the other end of the continuum, and that is a major deviation from the scope of employment. So, same example. Let's say that I decide one day to go off course for to spend time at my girlfriend's house, and I stay for about 90 minutes. All right, and the time is really not relevant, but I have kind of checked out of my route, my dry cleaning delivery route. All right, and during the process, I back into the house and damage it. So I back the delivery van into the house. Oops. And cause damage, right? Well, that's a frolic. And generally speaking, my employer is not going to be liable for that, right? Because I have totally checked out of the task at hand, the objective that I'm supposed to be, my job, essentially. All right, so that's a frolic. Generally, detours, employer is responsible. Frolics, employer is not responsible. All right, criminal acts. All right, so again, principals and agents are liable for their own criminal acts. That's a rule you can take to the bank. There is no set of circumstances that absolves someone from their own criminal acts. So what we're talking about here is, when can someone else also be held liable? All right. Well, principals can be held liable for criminal acts of their employees committed within the scope of employment. All right. So that should sound familiar based on the previous slide. If the agent is doing something to advance the interest of the principal, then the principal can also be held liable. All right. That'll do it for this sub-lecture. Check back in with you guys in a few moments.